All right, so this is Ancient Rome, part two. Last time we talked a lot more about the philosophies of ancient Rome, and then now we're moving, transitioning into the actual sports that they played and how those philosophies interacted with sport. Now, first off, I want to apologize. Normally, I try to wear neutral clothes, but I'm going to track meet with my team this weekend, um, and forgot to bring anything other than Baylor gear, so excuse me being decked out in a different school, but it's where I'm at right now. Next year, hopefully, I'll be decked out in Montreat gear, but for now, this is what we have. Um, but yeah, I'm in Lubbock, Texas. It's normally I like to say the places I am are lovely or beautiful, but can't say that about Texas Tech University. It's kind of a less than desirable place to be. Went for a short run last night and got plenty of middle fingers thrown at me, and then got kicked out of a restaurant for wearing Baylor gear. So, kind of a hostile place for how ugly it is around here. But, anyways, for us, we're going to be talking about Rome. Now, I'm going to start out with the change in time that has happened. What happened with Rome as it moved through time, at least in regards to sport. So, as I talked about last time, Romans were heavily influenced by two other ancient cultures. There was the Etruscans, which kind of took up central and northern Italy, and then you had the Greeks, who were spread out, but they were largely in southern Italy. So we don't know a ton about the Etruscans because, as you may have heard in history class, history is told by the winners, the victors, and the Etruscans lost. So what we know about the Etruscans was defined by the Greeks, who probably had a lot of propaganda going on. Um, so most of what you can read about the Etruscans written in that time period was Romans saying that their women were all prostitutes and their men were all stupid and weak, because that's what the Romans were trying to create in the rumor mill to make them a people that needed to be conquered so that Rome could take over and grow into what it became. Um, but despite the Romans saying how awful the Etruscans were, how undesirable their culture was, as we also talked about last time, the Romans like to take pieces away from other cultures. So they were like, we actually really like their sport. So we'll say, yeah, these people are terrible, and this sport wasn't their thing, but we're taking it. And the Etruscans were extremely violent in sports. They were, and I don't know the history completely, but I imagine this backfired when they were conquered, and then they were forced to compete in violent games that they had invented, but the Romans were now claiming as their own. So in early Roman time, we have some of this Greek style athletic competition where it was very much about being physically fit. It was kind of philosophical in nature. It was to serve gods or something higher, to connect everyone together. And in addition to this, we begin to see other more leisurely concepts come into play. So the Romans upper class started playing ball games. These were more for fun. They weren't preparing for war or battle like all the other games in history thus far had strong overtones of militaristic preparation. But the upper class start playing ball games. They start massage, so sort of a sports therapy idea, and then they also were extremely big on bathing pools or thermae. So what the Romans did is, rather than get at least the upper class, rather than getting all sweaty and really work up, get a good workout in, they largely would play a sport that was rather leisurely, that was very calm, um, less intense. They'd work up a light sweat, and then they'd get in the pool and hang out with their buddies. And they would just sit there and relax and talk. And be upper class Romans. In addition, they also were starting to see for the first time in history, um, the Greeks had developed ideas of health through physical fitness. Now the Romans start to adopt this, so they have gymnastics and basic like stretching and basic strengthening just for health. But again, most of this was rather leisurely and would end up with them going to the Thermae and just hanging out. Now, if you go down the social ladders, the lower tiers is where you see more of that Etruscan, the violence, and the real battle-driven sport. So you would have foot races, and yes, there'd be ball playing and equestrian, but it was a lot of these more one versus another competitive warlike sports. Now, as we move through time, the Romans are going to continue to develop their own culture independent of the Etruscans and Greeks. So as we go, it starts to become a lot less focused in physical fitness because as we talked about the philosophies of the Romans were big on enjoyment of life and finding happiness and joy. So, and they weren't really scared of death. So what they would do is rather than work on about physical fitness and being the strongest and best form of themselves, now they're starting to do sports more for for entertainment purposes. Excuse me, my brain was deviated from this conversation. But so Rome became a big spectator-driven sport culture. So you start to see mass entertainment. You had the gladiators who would battle and it'd be very violent and there'd be carnage and people would die, but it was all for this entertainment, things that really got their heart racing and got them excited to witness, but something that they definitely would not want to be part of. And we'll talk about this more as we go today. But this whole idea of physical fitness, of being the best version of themselves, is now being split away from their culture and instead replaced with more spectator, more leisurely things as you get later and later in the Roman Empire. Now, despite this, the military was still extremely important. So, if someone was in the military or someone who could be part of the military, then there was still rigorous physical training. From a young age, these warriors, these soldiers, were told to be extremely disciplined and extremely obedient. And soldiers were largely considered a desirable job to have. It was if you were a great soldier, then you were considered an upstanding member of society. Now, the Romans, as I talked about, had developed all these strong battle tactics and were very calculated in war. So they were greatly, greatly feared. They were in excellent physical shape, and they were there to protect the overall culture. And that was driven by, again, that Stoic philosophy of no matter where you are, you find happiness there, and you are not scared. You have no negative emotions. So you have these huge armies that were not scared of things. From a philosophical standpoint, they would go into battle and they would be tough, and they couldn't show that fear and emotion, and they would be happy and extremely disciplined and obedient and had extremely good tactics and made them wildly successful in their day. Now, one of the other cool things that kind of sprung up out of the military and Roman culture as a whole was the first ever evidence of sports medicine came from Rome. And that's, we have Claudius Galen. So Claudius Galen is often considered the father of sports medicine. He starts young learning medicine, and he practices on animals. He practices on gladiators, who will later talk about why he might have chosen them and not really felt remorse just running experiments on them. But also, he starts to develop ways that you can use medicine and understanding human movement to improve, have an improved quality of life, and those who are not competing, and then those who are competing, making sure they continue to compete and continue to drive the military without having to lose soldiers to little injuries, which is excellent. And it's a really cool development, right? Because what was then just this one guy kind of doing something is now something that you and I have studied large parts of our life to, is understanding how we move, why we move, and how that improves us and keeps us going. In addition, the Romans, I think it's important to note what the Roman women and how they interacted with sport, because we're starting to see, we have a lot of historical evidence as to what women were doing, unlike maybe in previous cultures that didn't track and didn't make it this far, so we don't know what sports they did or if they did sports at all. But despite this, they still weren't heavily documented. We only have so much information. But largely, sports for women weren't major competitions for entertainment. While the men went and had large stadiums of them competing, the women mostly did sport just for entertainment value. So, for example, in this picture, you have, I think we have 10 Roman women wearing bikinis, and they're playing sports. So you see up here, for example, this woman has dumbbells. You see holding in her hands there. And she's shown having broader shoulders than the others. See, narrower, these are more broad shoulders. So we know that Roman women, some would choose to weightlift. We have this woman here, she has the equivalent of a medicine ball today. These two are obviously playing some sort of game. These two are maybe volleying, like playing some sort of volleyball or a game of throwing and catching a ball. You have these women are doing something with vegetation, with plants. They aren't really sure. And then the 10th woman, you only see her legs, so we aren't really sure what she's doing. But the Roman culture, as many cultures were and still are today, was very male-driven. That's from a social standpoint, and that's from a political standpoint. It's a culture that was very patriarchal, so men had better positions than women, and in addition, you had a class stratification. So you had people who were upper class, you had people who were lower class. There was peasants and middle class, whatever. But yeah, so athletic competition was the domain of Roman men. Women mostly were just swimming, dancing, ball games, and those bathing pools where people would just sit in the pool and hang out and enjoy life. And we'll talk about women again in a minute, but I'm going to put a pause on this for now. Or, excuse me, apparently that slide was next. So the Olympics in Greek, as we talked about last week, didn't really allow women. The Greeks had no interest in women being in sport. They didn't want them observing it. If they did sport, it was on their own. It wasn't anything anybody watched. As Rome pushed Greece out, and you start getting this heavy Roman influence on Greek culture, the Olympic Games, which had been very, very male only, now was allowing for wrestling and running competitions for women, which is a great development in women's sports because before this, women weren't even seen on the same largest stages of athletic competition. They just weren't there, but now there was some representation. Now, what is debated but is likely true, is very likely true, and we just aren't sure of what degree it occurred, was um, women may have actually competed as gladiators. So, and like I said, the historians aren't entirely sure. There's writings that talk about this, but they aren't sure how accurate those writings are, um, or how extensive the participation actually was. But women would initially fight other women as gladiators. They would fight uh, dwarfs, as kind of twisted and crooked as that is. They would fight, but as they moved in through time, it started to be women might actually fight men for entertainment value. Um, but what we see as we move forward in time as well, this was introduced. There was periods of time where the Romans were like, "This is not okay," for various reasons, and we aren't entirely sure why it was outlawed for periods of time. In fact, one Roman emperor allows it for the first 7 years of his reign, and then one day it's like, "No, this is not okay," and changes. And we aren't sure what event occurred, if he saw something that didn't sit right with him, or if it was some more patriarchal reason where this is for men only. We don't know. Um, but what we do know is that women likely were gladiators in some form, though not as extensive as men. Now, sports in Greek culture and Etruscan culture were largely tied to festivals, and that continues with the Romans. Initially, the Romans had about only so many festivals and only so many large, elaborate days for athletic competition. So in the year 173 BC, there's only about 53 public holidays, 53 holidays celebrated by the Roman Empire as a whole. As we move near to us in time, move forward in time, there was nearly 200 festivals in the year 300. So over a 500-year period, you go from, out of the 365 days a year, there's like maybe one holiday a week. You're going to 4 holidays a week or 5 holidays a week throughout the civilization. So that's these festivals become really, really common. And there's lots of reasons why this might have occurred. So if you're a Roman politician, what's going to make the people happy? Oh yeah, you paying for them to go celebrate, to go have a big feast, to go watch some sports. Like, wouldn't that be great? Same things now. It's like, if you had a politician who was promising you, that you could have more days off a week during that time, they would pay to send you some chips and salsa, and they would make sure that there was your favorite sport on TV. You probably would, or at least a lot of people would probably be like, yeah, that's great, I'm going to vote for you. So it was a way to kind of incentivize people to vote for certain politicians. So it was a tactic used by politicians to gain support. In addition, there was this large belief in Roman times that, at least within the rulers or the politicians, was that if they gave festivals and gave sports as a distraction to the people, they were less likely to revolt, because revolts would come out of boredom. If people are always entertained, then they're less likely to sit around and say, you know what, this is boring, let's overthrow the government, or whatever it may be. So they created these spectacles to continue to entertain people and keep them incentivized to support their political system. Now, this included horse and chariot races, gladiator fights, and other forms of combat. Which, let's see here. Yes, we're start moving into gladiators and what happened. So the main architectural wonder that came out of ancient Rome, at least many would argue, is the Colosseum. And this was originally the Flavian Amphitheater. And it's absolutely amazing. If you look at this building, this is huge building, right? So it could fit 50,000 people. I mean, I think the Baylor football stadium, so this is a major D1 program, fits 56,000. So you're looking at a modern day, big college programs stadium was comparable in size to the Colosseum that this ancient Rome was able to build up. And it was this just architectural wonder. Not only was it huge, but there was, these spectators were cooled through scented water that kept them cool within the stadium. In addition, again, a lot of this was to gain the support of the people. So a lot of the politicians or the rich would throw food and presents to the crowd. Not unlike sports today. You go to a basketball game, they have the t-shirt guns, they shoot them at you, or maybe, one row wins a free pizza from Domino's because they were able to, pass a mascot quicker through their row, that sort of thing. Same idea here, except it's getting people to like politicians and the civilization as a whole, rather than getting people to like a university or a NFL team or an NBA team, right? But you're seeing a lot of stuff that's similar to today. So a typical day, you go in. First, you would have animal fights. Maybe that was animals fighting each other, or maybe that was people fighting animals. Then, if that gets boring, they'd start tossing men and women to the animals, and the animals would tear them apart. That's great. And then you would end the day with some gladiator fights, where they would fight to the death. And that was the most popular, was people versus people, not innocent, political rivals being thrown to animals unarmed and just getting mauled. In addition, there was some crazy stuff like Emperor Claudius in 52 AD flooded the Colosseum, had 19,000 slaves put onto ships, and they had big mass combat that occurred. So some pretty crazy stuff that these people were getting into. Huge on entertainment. They liked violence. Violence was big in their sport culture, so they made it happen. This is kind of dark when you look back and think that just how much death was occurring. I mean, you were literally having battles and war staged in front of people, sort of like we might watch a war movie. Well, they'd be like, we can't do movies. Theater isn't quite as exciting if you do war, so let's just make them actually battle in front of people. But yeah, so the Flavian Amphitheater was financed by the looting of the Temple of Jerusalem. You see that in this picture. And then they bring 12,000 Jews back as slaves to Rome, and they helped with the construction. So you're looking at basically the conquering of one group is now funding and providing the manpower for building up the culture of another group, which we have seen all through history. So you have here, this is the Circus Maximus. So this was another place in Rome where sport occurred. Here you would have chariot races. You can see, for example, in this picture, it's sort of like a track. You have one, two, three, four chariots going around. You'd have gladiator combats, and this one actually happened in front of 250,000 different spectators. If you look, it's a little bit less defined. Where's what stadium and what's not? And you would had it's of note in Christian history because there was huge amounts of Christians that were killed in these. So Christians might be the ones getting thrown to the animals. Christians might be the ones who were being burned as torches to light the stadium, or they might be forced to be gladiators and fight to the death. So, and that's an important note. So gladiators were not these. It's this weird juxtaposition where gladiators were both looked down upon and looked up to. So they were celebrated. They're these people. It's sort of like you watch sports on TV and you're like, whoa, they have so much skill. Like we kind of look up to athletes and top athletes in your sport because they're so skilled. Same idea with gladiators. But it would be as if being an athlete was like this kind of low, shameful thing to do. So being a gladiator was shameful. It was people who were criminals, who were political enemies, different groups that had been conquered and brought back to Rome. So while it was exciting and you looked up to them as this people who won things and were victorious, and you would like to track who was moving up the ranks or whatever it may be, they were also people that were enemies and looked down upon socially. So again, sports were a way to kind of keep people from revolting, and they realized that they needed to get rid of criminals and political enemies, so that's where gladiators spring upon. We'll entertain the people and keep them from revolting. Meanwhile, we'll take those who did revolt and we'll kill them off by just using them as entertainment for the others. So again, they're these people that are looked down upon. Now, if a gladiator was able to move their way up the ranks and they were victorious enough, then they would be given their freedom. And they could go on about their life, but they would have had to win a lot. So there was this interesting idea that springs out of the gladiators that, again, it's a shameful people. No one wants to be a gladiator, but if you were a gladiator that was victorious and given freedom, and who had won enough, then they were these people that were really looked up to. There were a few Romans who were free men. They weren't slaves. They weren't political enemies or anything, or criminals. But they were like, you know what? I want to be a gladiator. Because if I can win enough, then I will be celebrated and looked up to. So they were called the Octorati. Now, these people would go, they'd volunteer to basically be slaves for years, to be spat upon by society, in hopes that someday they wouldn't die as gladiators, but they would be able to move up and be celebrated. Kind of a, I don't know, very high risk, medium reward situation, which is sort of what made it less common. But they did exist. Now, there's 4 major classes of gladiators, and those are the 4 that I have highlighted. But beyond that, there was maybe 8 classes, and maybe some subclasses, but we'll just say 8 classes. First one, I forgot to look these up. I apologize, but the Thracian, I'll say, and this class of gladiator was a major one. They had a small shield and a short sword. Really maneuverable. They didn't have to carry a lot around. They really focused on agility. Now, if you were a big, strong, powerful guy, then maybe you would go into the Murmillo class of gladiator. And these, again, kind of have a sword and shield, but this time rather than small shield, small sword, they had large sword, large shield. They weren't very maneuverable. They could be attacked easily by agile people, but they had a lot of protection and a big sword, and they were powerful people normally. Now, there's the Retiarius, and they had a weighted sack, as you see in this hand, which means it's like this long, fabric-y sack sort of thing. But at the end, there'd be a weight, so they could throw it and use it to kind of catch things, almost like a net, and tear them away or pull them down. And then they had a trident. So they could throw their sack at someone, disarm them, and then get them with the trident. Now, one that wasn't a major class that existed, you have the Secutor. And they looked a little bit more like this. They had a curved shield, a sword, probably something like a Vermillo. Next, you had a Velitus. They had no shield. All they had was a spear. They were kind of looked down upon, as you might guess. Because even within gladiators, gladiators were the lowest class, but there was lower classes. Then you had the Samnite, which is a large group, looked a little bit like this one. I skipped around. Velitus was this one here. Then you had the Samnite, which they had two swords. Or no, I was right. This is the Samnite, excuse me. This is the Demacharis. They had two swords. Made them super agile. They had two things, but they had no protection. And then you had the Lacurius. And the Lacurius had a trident and basically a noose. Lacurius was a low group. In fact, some historians think they were actually more jesters than anything. So they'd go out there and kind of taunt people, and they weren't really gladiators or part of the match just because they were kind of ill prepared for battle. But yeah. Now, each of these groups was kind of dressed as a particular Roman enemy. So it was to kind of display that these are the low class people were people who looked like enemies. And they would fight to the death. So one, for example, we'll take the Samnite out. I wanted to point them out. So that's 1, 2, 3. It was this one right here. So the Samnites looked like the people that had been captured. So looked down upon. They were popular gladiators because they're the enemies. You wanted enemies to be gladiators, but all of a sudden the Samnite kind of, even though they had been conquered by Rome, kind of came back in the picture later as an ally to Rome, and all of a sudden the Samnites were no longer as popular of a class of gladiator, because if they were popular and allies, then that was kind of this weird, like, why are you guys making fun of us in your big battles in front of 250,000 people? We don't want to be your friends anymore. It's kind of, the Romans would feel bad because this allies now they're making fun of over here. So it kind of fell out of popularity, which is kind of an interesting that even within these classes, they would rise and fall in popularity as time went out. And gladiators were by far the most popular event in the Colosseum, which makes sense. Think of all the movies about gladiators today, or mentions and culture to them. So Gladiators basically were said, okay, we're going to follow the rules, or we will be burnt with fire, shackled with chains, whipped with rods, and killed with steel. Well, they took an oath to go about this, right? Now, the gladiators were trained in these places, rigorous training. They were low class of people. Again, I know I'm really harping on that, but I want you to understand that they were glorified in one sense, but very much not glorified in the social sense. So they would go to school, they would be prepared before they were able to go compete. So, for example, in Pompeii, you see one of the best preserved gladiator schools. You have their barracks where they would live, then they'd have their practice fields. They would be there until they were ready to go. So, sport and Christianity. So, Christianity initially so they were enemies of the Romans. So basically, the Romans were using the Christians to throw them out into to be victims of this. So they might be gladiators, they might be thrown to the animals to be mauled, they might be burned as torches. Not exactly what the Christians like to do, right? That seems awful. So as you can imagine, Christians were sort of like, no, we don't like this. So Christian writers kind of condemned Roman sport. And they were told to avoid it. If they were free and able to go watch, they were told not to, but some did anyways. So as you can imagine, once Christianity rose within the Roman Empire, and now the emperors and the politicians began to be heavily influenced by Christianity or Christians themselves, it starts to fade away. The sport, as the Romans knew it, starts to fade away. Once the Christian Empire replaces the Romans, they continue with chariot racing, but a lot of like the Olympic events, like we talked about in Greece, were no longer there because the Christians were like, okay, this is celebrating pagan gods, or this is celebrating something we do not believe in, as well as they had been victims, so they were kind of had a distaste for sports. And then you'll see sports kind of shifts maybe more towards what we know them today because of this. All right, that's all I have. Again, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting to you. Bye.